So eventually, you follow it through the Egyptian culture, and you find that it is removed from that culture by high priests that eventually realize that he is not Egyptian, but that he is actually born from Jewish descendants, and his name is Moses. And he, revolts against the Pharaoh of the time. Everybody knows the story about the battles of manifestation that goes on. Frogs are falling from the sky. He throws his staff down and changes it into a snake and all these things. And then eventually he wins that battle of manifestation that might be related to being able to use this technology. Who can use it the best? And then he wins this, and the Pharaoh's allowing to leave, and with his tribes of Israel. And he takes off, but being the highest priest in Egypt, he has access to this object. And what I believe, and it's clear in the Bible when you read it, as he's going towards the Red Sea, he is following something very specific. This pillar of cloud and this pillar of light at night that he's following towards the Red Sea. I believe he actually takes off with the object, which is not what the high priest expected and the Pharaoh expected. So the Pharaoh realized he's taken off with this object. He gets upset about it, turns around and chases after him. In the Bible, it just says that he had a change of heart. I believe that it's because he realized that Moses left with this very powerful object. Moses goes towards the Red Seas following this object, and then it's said that he lifts his staff and the Red Sea opens. But if you actually read in the Bible much later, there's another instance where water is separated, and that is when the crossing of the Jordan occurs. And it's in the section where Joshua is now in charge of the tribes of Israel. And in this instant, it is much clearer. There's much more detail on how it's done. And it's clear, and if you read it, that the Ark of the Covenant of God was used to open the Jordan. And in the paragraphs where it talks about it, it says, "And it shall be said that the Jordan was open as the Red Sea was opened by Moses." And saying that the same forces were used to open the Red Sea before. And that means that the power of the ark is not the box object that's described in the Bible as being built at the foot of Mount Sinai after crossing the Red Sea, but the power is something that was an object that was taken out of Egypt, and eventually that needed to be placed in some kind of protective device that is described as the box-like object covered in gold on the outside and covered in gold on the inside, which is basically a large capacitor, right? Which a capacitor is a device that holds energy and that could, in this case, shield the energy. And so it was most appropriate if they were going to travel in the desert that they built as fast as possible some kind of device to carry this object around. And so there's a split there that happens. There's a misunderstanding there that happens. The power of the ark is one object, and the ark itself is another. And the power of the ark, I believe, came right out of Egypt, which came prior to that, right out of the evolution of Atlantis. And that's why Plato, by getting information from the high priest of Egypt, got information about Atlantis. And so that these objects that probably were commonplace in Atlantis. Only a few was left after the great flood, after the great catastrophe. And these objects were found to be left both in Egypt, in South America, in the Mexican region, and so on. And so eventually Moses brings it through the desert, and it takes them 40 years to go through a desert that Bedouins, well-routed terrain, was well known to have only taken 6 months to 7 months at the most to cross. And why is it that it's taking so long? Well, when you read the Bible and you read biblical texts and rabbinic texts and, all sorts of different levels of information, it's clear that the Ark is what's leading the tribes of Israel. And it's well documented in those texts that the Ark would lift on its own and take off. And the tribes of Israel would follow it. And then eventually it would settle somewhere, and it could stay there for years. And they would wait for the Ark to lift again and move again. And so they were following this object through the desert. And every time it would settle somewhere, they would build the tabernacle tents around it, and they would build a fence around that to keep the uninitiates away from it, because there was many mishaps with this object where people would touch it and die and get electrocuted. It was said that the fire of God would kill them, and so on. So you can imagine the complexity, and you can imagine the difficulty it is to decode what was being said at the time, because you're dealing with people that probably didn't have concepts of technology. So they saw this object as some kind of power, some kind of God. And that, complexifies the decoding of this information. For instance, they called the Ark of the Covenant of God. If you look up where the word God came from for the translation of the Bible text, it came from the Greek word, the tetragrammaton. And the tetragrammaton has very specific sets of information attached to it that has to do with Kabbalistic traditions, Kabbalistic texts, which was actual oral traditions until, the first century, that were passed from high initiate to another, and were never supposed to be written down, was never supposed to be become popular knowledge, and described the whole cosmology of the geometry of space, attached to a very specific geometry called the Kabbalistic tree, which I eventually decoded to show that it relates directly to the 64 tetrahedral grid of the structure of the vacuum, said to be centered by a crown of infinite density, the singularity. I mean, it's all there, but it's described in terms of a society that wouldn't have technical knowledge, that would describe it in the best they could with what they had at the time. And that's where the difficulty comes from, because typically all this information and all these texts are interpreted either as elaborations of people with too much imagination, or great philosophy from religious beliefs and so on, but never as actual technical, physical knowledge that could transform our society. And that has been completely missed. And that is what my work is bringing forth, showing that, this information has a base in science, has a base in physics, and it can lead us to being able to reproduce this technology and transform our society to bring us back to a much higher level of technological advancements and evolution, but this time with the evolution of 5,000 years of maturity that we have gained.
I think this